A woman gave birth in silence. There was no screaming, no crying, only the low, distant hum of a storm rolling across the hills of a forgotten outer rim world. The rain fell softly on cracked rooftops. The midwife waited for the sound of a newborn's voice. It never came. The girl did not cry. Her eyes were already open when she entered the world, calm, watching, quiet, as if she had been awake long before birth. The mother held her, weak and pale, whispering prayers to no one. And the child blinked once, slowly, like she understood. She was named Gean. There were no celebrations. No neighbors came. Even the father did not stay long. People said she was cursed. Others said the Force had touched her. But no one ever said it with joy. There was something in her presence that turned warmth cold. By her first year, she still had not cried. Not once. When she fell, she did not scream. When she was hungry, she made no sound. When she was afraid, she stared, eyes wide. Still, the animals in the village avoided her. The birds never landed near her home. And when strangers passed through town, they looked at her and forgot why they had come. She did not speak until she was nearly 4, and when she did, her voice was gentle, slow, and unsettling. Not because it was loud, but because it felt like she had always known how to speak and had simply chosen not to. One night, during the 3rd moonstorm of the cycle, the old healer came to visit her family. The girl had been drawing patterns into the clay walls of their home. Strange curves, symbols that didn't match any language. The healer asked her what they meant. She answered without looking up, "They're not mine. They're just what I remember." The healer left before sunrise, and by morning the symbols were gone. There were other moments, quiet ones, forgotten by most but never erased. The time she stared into a dying fire and spoke the names of 2 villagers who would pass in the days ahead. The time she walked into the woods alone and returned with an injured bird the village thought extinct. She always knew where people were. She always knew when something was about to end. And when they asked her how she knew, she said nothing. Gean's mother kept her close. But even love, when held too tightly around fear, begins to fracture. She watched her daughter with both tenderness and terror, and in time, the tenderness began to fade. By the age of 7, Gean had stopped trying to be understood. She would sit alone under the rusting towers on the edge of the village, watching the stars blink through clouds, listening to nothing. Or perhaps listening to something no one else could hear. Sometimes she would speak aloud when no one was near, words that sounded like memories, names that weren't hers, places she'd never seen. She was dreaming while awake, remembering a life that hadn't been lived yet. And far above, in the silent dark between systems, a Jedi transport re-entered real space. Its pilot wasn't following orders. He was following a ripple, a tremor in the Force that had no name and no source. Just a feeling, cold and persistent, like a voice from underwater. A voice that wasn't calling out, but calling back. The rains never stopped. Even when the clouds broke, even when the sky cleared, the ground still wept. It soaked through the roots. It crawled through the stone. And it echoed soft and steady through the broken gutters of a village that had forgotten the sun. Gean never minded the rain. She would walk through it without a hood, her face turned upward, her eyes half closed. The others watched from behind windows, never speaking, never asking why the storms followed her. But they did. Every time Gean left her home, the clouds would gather. The air grew colder. The wind picked up. And though no one said it aloud, they began to believe the weather listened to her. Or worse, that it feared her. She never claimed power. never raised her voice, but strange things happened when she was near. The village priest once held a gathering to bless her away. The next morning, he was found silent and shaking, kneeling in the wet grass with his eyes shut tight. He would not speak for a week. When he did, all he said was that the air had changed, that it had been watching him. People began to say she spoke to the rain. Children whispered that she could walk without leaving footprints, that she could hear things through walls, that when she stared at you too long, you forgot what day it was. Most laughed, but none laughed near her. Only one girl, a neighbor named Kaylin, dared speak with Gean face to face. She was bold, kind, and unafraid. She gave Gean small flowers wrapped in scraps of cloth, danced barefoot in the mud beside her. Once she gave her a shell, cracked and silvered from age. "It's yours," Kaylin said. "So you remember someone loves you." Gean didn't answer. She only held the shell close and smiled, once, small and tired. That night, Kaylin fell sick. Within days, she was gone. No marks, no wounds, no signs of plague. The doctors were silent, the mothers wept. And when they came to Gean's home, her mother barred the door and said only 3 words. She didn't mean to. After that, no one visited again. The storm that followed was the worst the village had seen in decades. Roofs collapsed, rivers overflowed. The elders called it a curse, but the people had already made up their minds. The child was the cause. Even if she never moved, even if she never harmed a soul, it was her. It had always been her. Her mother, once proud and defiant, began to fade. She spent her days praying to vanished gods, her nights watching the door. And Gean, too young to stop it, too old to pretend she didn't understand, grew quieter. Not out of shame, not even fear, but because she knew the difference between words that heal and words that break. So she stopped speaking. She stopped meeting eyes. She spent her nights outside, in the field beyond the last fence, where only lightning kept her company. And in that silence, something listened. Not the villagers, not the wind. Something older. Something that did not wait to be summoned, only remembered. One night, as she stood beneath the hollow tree, her hand outstretched to the rain, the lightning struck not the ground but the sky itself. A single flash, reversed. Brightness swallowed by shadow. And in its place, a whisper. She turned her head slightly, just enough to show she had heard. A voice, not in basic, not in thought, but in memory, deep, calm, inevitable. It said nothing cruel, nothing grand, only this: "You are ready." The Jedi did not come for her. They came because something had shifted, a presence in the Force, soft, persistent, and entirely untraceable. It wasn't dark, it wasn't light, it simply was. A tremor stretched across the outer rim, pulling at the senses of those who could feel, but offering nothing in return. Knight Silen Vaughn wasn't known for his instincts. He was measured, quiet, a loyal servant of the code. And yet, he found himself drifting further into the edges of forgotten space, following a signal no one else believed was real. Ord Vilek wasn't on most maps. The last Jedi to set foot there had done so in another lifetime, and the mission had ended in silence. Disappearances, cut comms, a warning without explanation. Now it was only a storm world, wet and broken. Silen arrived in a civilian craft and wore no robes. He didn't want to frighten anyone, but the moment he stepped onto the soil, he realized he was already too late. Not because the girl had gone, but because whatever had called to him was already listening. He walked through the village. No one welcomed him. The people averted their eyes. They muttered to one another and shut their doors. He asked questions. Most pretended not to hear. Others denied the girl ever existed. One woman stared at him for a long time before saying only this: "She never learned how to speak, but she knows what we're thinking." Silent didn't ask again. The Force guided him without words, toward the tree. It stood outside the last row of homes, dead and hollowed by lightning, yet somehow still standing. Beneath it sat the girl, alone, dry, though it had rained all morning. She looked up as he approached, not startled, not curious. She was expecting him. Her gaze held no fear, just silence, the kind of silence that made noise feel like an intrusion. He didn't speak at first. He simply sat beside her. The air felt thinner here. He could hear his heartbeat. He could feel her watching him, not with her eyes, but with something older, something deeper. He finally asked her name. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to face the mountain ridge, where the sky hung low and gray, and her lips parted just enough to speak one word: "Gone, do one." It wasn't clear if she meant someone, or something, or herself. But Silent understood. The Force was not centered on her. It curved around her, like wind bending around stone. She wasn't using it. She wasn't resisting it. She simply existed beneath it. He reached out his hand. She looked at it, then at him. And for the first time since he had landed, she blinked. When she placed her fingers in his, it was not with hesitation. It was with peace. The storm broke as they walked back through the village. Doors creaked, windows opened, but no one stepped out. No one stopped them. No one could. She didn't say goodbye to her mother. Her mother didn't ask her to stay. They had both known this would happen since the moment she was born. And as the ship lifted through the clouds, into the quiet above, Night Silent turned once to look back. But the girl did not. The Jedi Temple was not meant for children like her. Its halls were warm, its light was pure, its ceilings stretched endlessly, filled with quiet laughter and old chants. There was peace here, structured peace, taught, practiced, measured. But Jean did not feel peace. She felt containment. They gave her robes too large for her frame, trimmed them down, and showed her how to fold them. They taught her how to sit, how to bow, how to sleep in a bed that had been prepared for dozens of others before her. She followed, without question. She mimicked the older initiates perfectly. But there was no curiosity behind her actions. Only compliance and silence. The other children spoke often, some nervous, some excited, some eager to please. But when Jean entered a room, they grew quieter, not in fear, not in awe, just uncertainty. Like something within her made them forget what they were about to say. When the instructors asked her questions, she answered only with a glance, never rude, never hesitant, just watchful, listening as if the words they spoke were not being heard, but weighed like old memories being tested against something she already knew. One instructor, a kind Twi'lek named Master Ilvarin, tried to break through. He brought her a small holocron, one meant for training focus. When he placed it in her hands, it glowed brighter than it ever had for any of the others. But Jean didn't react. She just stared at the light. And after a moment, the holocron dimmed, then shut itself off. The temple droids ran diagnostics. They found no fault. When they tried again, the device refused to respond to anyone for 3 days. Still, she never spoke. Not in the gardens, not in the dining halls, not in her room. Even when the other younglings tried to talk to her, she would nod, she would smile, faintly, but her silence remained constant, intentional. It wasn't shyness. It was endurance. She meditated alone. Not on the code, not on mantras, but in ways the masters couldn't quite name. Hours would pass, and she would not move, not twitch, not blink. Once, a senior knight placed a sensor around her to record her connection to the Force during one of these trances. What they saw made them erase the data immediately. The patterns resembled something ancient, not dark, not corrupted, just alien. She was assigned to a different instructor after that. And then another, and then another. None of them filed complaints, but none of them asked to continue. The council reviewed her progress after one cycle. No infractions, no refusals, no fear, and yet, no belonging. They whispered about her in private. She doesn't ask questions. She doesn't push back. She learns too fast, but not new things. It's as if she's remembering. By the end of the year, she was still among the initiates, still following protocol, still moving in silence. But the temple itself had grown, uneasy. Lights flickered more often in her wing. Archives misplaced files that had never been touched. Holoprojectors replayed images that no one had requested. And when Gean walked past the room of 1,000 fountains, the water would ripple even when the air was still. The Jedi taught that disturbance in the Force was a warning. But what do you call it when the disturbance is calm? She had no friends, no attachments, only presence. And somewhere in the heart of the temple, behind doors not opened in decades, a master stirred from meditation and spoke one sentence to the empty room. She has arrived. There were no questions in her heart, not when she stepped through the temple gates, not when they placed a robe over her shoulders, and not when they asked her name. She answered when prompted, bowed when instructed, sat in silence while the others recited oaths they didn't yet understand. The youngest initiates looked to the masters for approval. They hesitated before each word, but Gean did not hesitate. She simply obeyed, not with pride, not with humility, with familiarity, like someone who had already walked these halls before and had simply returned to finish something forgotten. The Jedi Temple was a place of tradition. There were rituals here older than the Republic. Every trial had meaning. Every silence was sacred. But when Gean sat in the meditation halls, that silence changed. It no longer felt sacred. It felt still, motionless, the kind of stillness that makes one wonder whether anything is moving at all. She didn't ask where the Force came from. She didn't ask what the code meant. She didn't fumble over the difference between peace and serenity, attachment and love. Not because she had already mastered it, but because she saw through it. The code wasn't a map to her. It was a pattern. And patterns could be learned. The instructors whispered about her after hours. They didn't mean to, but the whispers came. She's obedient, yes, but not eager. She doesn't seem to need guidance. It's as if she's remembering, not learning. Master Pelor, a scholar of ancient rites, requested a one-on-one observation. He believed she was a prodigy, that she had some rare form of mnemonic force sensitivity, a connection to past lives or old energies. He assigned her reading from pre-Republic texts. She finished them in 2 days, but when he questioned her afterward, she quoted lines that had never been translated aloud. Lines even he had skipped. She corrected him gently, not to prove herself, but because she thought he already knew. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't confidence. It was recognition. She spoke the way a child might tell a parent their own bedtime story back to them slowly, carefully, as if worried they might not remember how it ends. The Jedi Council began watching. Not openly, not through confrontation, but with silence. They placed her in rooms with unstable initiates, ones who struggled to control their impulses. Without fail, those children grew quiet around her, focused, soft, not because she taught them, because they felt seen. And when she was moved to different wings of the temple, strange things followed. Meditation crystals flickered. Hollow projectors looped visions of the past. One time, the archives logged her presence in 3 locations at once, a sensor error, they claimed. But the archive staff never made that mistake again. The temple's halls had never been so quiet. And through it all, Gean never asked for more. Other initiates chased approval, dreamed of lightsabers, imagined knighthood. She didn't. She didn't even carry training weapons. When offered a basic saber hilt, she accepted it. She held it, balanced it, then placed it down. Not with fear, but with indifference, like someone who had already held the real thing. Long ago, in a memory that didn't belong to this life. She didn't speak of her past. She didn't ask about her future. She just walked, listened, watched. And the masters began to wonder, what does it mean when a Jedi child has nothing left to seek? There were places in the Jedi Temple where the Force gathered like mist. Old corridors, meditation chambers, forgotten vaults deep beneath the archives, spaces where time slowed and memory clung to the walls like dust. These places were meant to be sacred, reserved for the quiet study of deeper currents. But after Gean arrived, those currents began to shift. Master Sadi, a Mirialan known for her stillness, was the first to feel it. During her evening meditations, she began to sense echoes that weren't hers, thoughts that brushed the edge of her consciousness fragments, like someone had passed through her mind without entering. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't intrusive. It was present, watching. Not all masters felt it, but those attuned to deeper layers of the Force began to notice patterns. A distant hum in their quarters, holocrons that failed to activate, crystals that vibrated slightly when held. At first, they blamed the machinery, then the architecture, but the whispers pointed elsewhere. They pointed to her. She didn't speak of it, didn't react to it. When questioned about strange phenomena, she blinked slowly and tilted her head as if hearing something they could not. And sometimes she was. One morning, the temple's oldest holocron, a Sith relic secured in a sealed chamber, activated on its own. Not with sound, not with light, but with motion. Its casing shifted, just slightly, as if responding to a presence it had once known. Gean had not touched it. She hadn't even entered the chamber. But when the Keeper of Law checked the surveillance records, he saw her standing in the adjacent hallway. Still, unblinking, for 2 hours. The next day, that hallway was closed for repairs. But those who walked near it still reported a chill. Master Thomir, one of the Order's senior investigators, requested a formal evaluation. He did not accuse. He did not fear her. But he knew what he had felt. He met with Gean privately, in the Room of Echoes, a chamber designed to amplify Force resonance for teaching purposes. The moment she stepped inside, the room dimmed, not from power loss, from energy being absorbed. They sat across from each other. He asked her to meditate. She did. After only 1 minute, he ended the session. When asked why, he said only this: she does not touch the Force the way we do. She remembers it, like a language forgotten and spoken again. He did not file a report. He left the chamber and did not return for 7 days. Gean, for her part, continued her training without change. She ate what was served, slept when the cycle ended, walked the same halls, read the same texts, and wherever she went, the Force whispered a little louder, not with prophecy, not with danger, but with recognition. One Padawan, older than her, claimed that whenever Gean was near, his thoughts slowed down, that he could hear his own fear more clearly, as if someone was holding a mirror to his mind. Another said he dreamed of places he'd never seen. Ruins, darkened stars, a voice saying his name, but not in basic. No harm was done. No rules were broken. But the temple was changing, not from the outside, not from conflict or corruption, but from a single presence walking silently through its heart, a girl who never looked directly at the masters watching her, but somehow always knew they were there. And each time she passed one of them in the halls, they felt the same thing. Like she wasn't the one being observed. She was the one observing. The trials were never meant for children. They were small tests, at first, designed only to guide the youngest minds. Blocks that floated when lifted. Simple illusions. Moments of patience. Nothing more than steps along a long, disciplined path. But when Gean reached them, something in the rhythm of the temple shifted again. Most initiates struggled. They hesitated. Their minds wandered. The Force came to them in bursts, weak one moment, strong the next. But to Gean, it came like breath. Not controlled, not summoned, just present. The first trial was concentration. A sphere of light, suspended in a quiet room, meant to dim and brighten with the student's emotional balance. For many, it took hours just to keep the sphere steady. Gean entered the chamber. The sphere flared once, then dimmed. Then, without any visible effort, it matched her heartbeat, perfectly pulsing in slow, steady waves. The instructors monitoring the test exchanged glances. They were used to prodigies. But this wasn't skill. This was familiarity, as if the sphere already knew her. The second trial measured memory. Students were asked to watch a series of images projected through the Force places they had never seen. Symbols they could not name. Histories far older than the Republic. Then they were asked what they remembered. Gean did not wait for the projection to begin. She recited the images before they appeared. Word for word, detail for detail. The instructor froze, unsure if the device had malfunctioned. But the projection continued anyway, revealing each image she had already spoken aloud. She didn't smile. She didn't seem proud. She looked tired, as if remembering something she wished she could forget. The third trial was emotional clarity, a test designed to reveal attachments or hidden fears. Gean stood before a panel of masters while the Force drew on her subconscious, creating illusions meant to challenge her heart. But nothing appeared. The chamber remained empty, silent, still. The masters waited. The Force did nothing. It wasn't that her mind was shielded. It wasn't that she hid her fears. It was that the illusions couldn't find anything to shape. Her emotions were quiet, deep, buried so far beneath the surface that even the Force seemed unsure how to touch them. One master whispered, "The trial is searching, but can't reach her." Another whispered back, "Then what is she holding inside?" When dismissed, Gean bowed politely and left the room. The masters stayed behind. None of them spoke for several minutes. The fourth trial was instinct saber forms practiced without guidance. Younglings held wooden training blades, moving through simple sequences while instructors corrected stances. Gean moved last. Her form was perfect. Not flawless in a technical sense, flawless in familiarity. She flowed through each pattern, as though she had performed them many times before. Her footwork, spacing, and timing were all correct, but not learned, not new. Remembered. One knight asked who had trained her before she arrived. Silent Vaughn answered quietly, "No one." Another whispered, "Then who taught her body to move like that?" No one had an answer. By the end of the cycle, the instructors were no longer evaluating her abilities. They were watching her reactions, looking for something human, some moment of doubt, or fear, or joy, anything that would make her feel like the other initiates, but she offered nothing. Not because she was hiding, but because there was nothing to reveal. She was progressing at a pace that made no sense, not even for the most gifted Force sensitives. And each time a new task was placed before her, she completed it with the same quiet expression, as if she already knew the outcome, as if she had done it all before. And somewhere in the temple, whispers began to grow louder. How do you test someone who cannot be tested? She never asked to be chosen. She didn't stand taller during evaluations. She didn't volunteer first during partner drills. And she didn't look to the masters for their approval. But the Force did. While others reached for it, bent toward it, tried to feel its flow, the Force seemed to bend around her. Quietly, naturally, as if following her footsteps, not the other way around. And she never chased it. She simply moved through it. The initiates around her began to change, not in how they spoke but in how they listened. Their voices softened when she entered a room. Their tempers cooled. Even those who once ignored meditation now lingered longer in silence. Not because they understood, but because they felt something shift in her presence. Something they couldn't name. One evening, as the twin moons fell over Coruscant's horizon, a group of initiates sat in the temple gardens for silent reflection. A common ritual. Simple, routine. But when Gean walked between them, none of them noticed. Not because she was stealthy, not because she was hiding, because, for a few moments, she wasn't there. Not in the way most beings are. She moved through the group like wind moves through trees, unseen but known. And when she sat down at the center, every initiate in the circle opened their eyes at once. They hadn't heard her arrive, but all of them had felt it. She closed her eyes, folded her hands, breathed once. And for the next hour, not one of them made a sound. It wasn't fear. It wasn't respect. It was alignment, a stillness that pulled the room into her rhythm, without effort or command. When the masters reviewed her progress weeks later, they found no faults, no aggression, no misconduct, but no bonds either. No Padawan friends, no rivalries, no attachments of any kind. Master Oren Davi, a temple elder known for sensing emotional undercurrents, visited her chamber unannounced. He asked her what she hoped for. She said nothing. He asked what she feared. Still nothing. Only when he stood to leave did she speak, one word, soft. Memory. He turned back, but she was already watching the door. The council didn't mark it as a warning. They marked it as a reflection, but no one could agree on what it meant or why it felt so much heavier than it sounded. Soon after, her name was placed on a list. Candidates to become Padawans. The other initiates celebrated. Quiet cheers, hushed dreams of lightsabers and masters and missions. But Gean showed no reaction. No joy, no fear. She accepted the next step as she had accepted the first. Without resistance, without hesitation, But that night, when the temple dimmed and the fountains stilled, she remained awake, sitting on the balcony above the training wing, alone, with her eyes turned toward the stars. And for the first time since arriving, she wept, not in sorrow, not in pain, but in recognition, as if something in her had finally caught up with her body, something old, something buried, not a vision of the future, but a shadow from the past. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe, sat silently until morning, and when the sun returned to Coruscant, so did her calm. No one knew what she saw that night, but the Force did, because from that day forward, the temple's energy shifted again, not with noise, not with movement, but with direction. It no longer guided her. It followed her. Because Gean was no longer waiting to be chosen. The silence had already chosen her. It was supposed to be simple. A minor diplomatic disturbance in the mid-rim. No bloodshed, no armies. Just two systems disputing the trade rights to a shrinking hyperspace corridor. The kind of negotiation the Jedi had mediated 100 times before. Master Ilvarin was selected to lead the mission. Gean was only meant to accompany her, an observant Padawan, quiet and promising, there to listen, to witness, to learn. The assignment was meant to last 4 days. It lasted only 2. The planet was called Relkan. Once a mining colony during the days of the Old Republic, its crust had been gutted centuries ago and left to recover. The surface was dull, cracked, windswept. The native population had long since fled, leaving only administrative stations, diplomats, and one abandoned structure the locals called the Broken Vault. It wasn't on any official map. It had no doors, only stairs that led down into the stone, untouched by time or wind. Gean didn't ask to go there, but as Master Ilvarin met with the senators above, Gean wandered, not aimlessly. Drawn, she followed the tremor, not in the Force, but in her own awareness. A faint pressure at the edge of thought, like a memory she hadn't lived yet, pulling her toward the vault like gravity. No one saw her descend. The steps were smooth, untouched by dust. The silence grew thicker with each level. Not oppressive, but complete. When she reached the final chamber, she didn't ignite a light. She didn't need to. The air felt clear. The dark was soft. And at the center of the room, it waited. A simple shape, a black obelisk carved from obsidian, etched with circular patterns that pulsed when she approached. Not with warning, not with threat. With recognition, she stepped forward, placed one hand on the surface, and the moment her fingers touched the stone, she heard it. Not a scream, not a whisper, a voice, her voice, gentle, calm, inevitable. It didn't speak in words, not yet, but it filled her thoughts with something she had never truly known. Warmth. Not the warmth of sunlight or fire, the warmth of attention, of being known, not as a student, not as an initiate, but as herself. Whoever that truly was. She didn't pull away. She didn't question. Because for the first time since entering the temple, she wasn't alone inside her mind. When Master Ilvarin found her an hour later, Gean was standing still, eyes open, hand by her side, as if nothing had happened. The master asked if she was hurt. Gean shook her head. Ilvarin asked if she'd seen anything. Gean simply said, no. And yet, when they returned to their ship, something followed her. Not in the cargo hold, not in the air. Inside her, a presence. Not dark, not light. Something quieter. Like the echo of her own breath, like the shadow of her own voice. She didn't speak of it during the return to Coruscant. But from that moment on, she stopped meditating the way she'd been taught. Not because she didn't believe in it, but because she no longer needed to search inward to find silence. Now, when she closed her eyes, it spoke back. The temple healers examined her upon return. Routine scans, routine questions, no sign of physical harm, no measurable change in her midichlorian count, no disruptions in her nervous system. They declared her stable, balanced, unshaken. But something in her demeanor had changed. She still followed instructions, still moved as she always had, quiet, deliberate, unseen when she wanted to be. But her silence was no longer passive. It was listening. In group meditations, her posture stayed perfect. Her eyes stayed closed, but her presence pulled attention. Not through the force, through stillness. The other Padawans said it felt like they were being watched, not judged, not violated, just seen, completely, as if every thought they hadn't spoken yet was already laid bare in her mind. She said nothing, she asked nothing, but her silence lingered long after she left the room. Master Ilvarin noticed the shift first. She asked Gean if the artifact had affected her, if she felt different, disoriented, disconnected. Gean didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, she said, "It didn't change me, it reminded me." Ilvarin didn't press further, but she made a quiet request to the archives. The vault on Relkan wasn't just abandoned. It had been catalogued centuries ago, a Sith reliquary sealed after the new Sith Wars. The Council had deemed it inert, stripped of all dangerous power, but its records had never been updated. No one had checked it since before Gean was born, because there was no reason to. Until now, Ilvarin returned to the chamber's sensor logs. They showed nothing, no activation, no emission, no detectable movement. And yet, when she meditated that night, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Uncertainty, not fear, not danger, just the feeling of being unprepared. Gean, meanwhile, stopped using the temple's meditation chambers altogether. She began practicing alone, outside scheduled hours, not in defiance, in instinct. She no longer sat in silence to find peace. She sat in silence to listen, and slowly, the voice began to return, not always clearly, not always in words, but in impressions. It didn't speak as a teacher. It spoke as a memory, a familiar rhythm, a phrase before she thought of it, a movement in saber form that her instructors hadn't taught, but her hands performed without hesitation. And when she was alone, she began to respond, not aloud, not in thought, but through attention. Every question the temple refused to answer she offered to the silence. And the silence answered back, not with explanations, with feeling. The archives began registering anomalies when she passed. Holocrons blinking, doors unlocking without prompt. One morning, an old recording from the Great Hyperspace War activated on its own, showing a Sith fortress nearly identical in design to the vault on Relkan. She watched the footage, once, silently, then turned it off. She already knew how it ended, because in her dreams she had been there, not as a warrior, not as an enemy, but as someone standing just outside the light, not hiding, waiting. And in that place behind her thoughts, the voice murmured again, her voice, but colder, gentler, older. "You are not alone in this." Meditation had always been the one place the Jedi trusted, a practice older than the Order itself, a space where thought settled, where fear softened, where the mind became clear. For most, meditation was a refuge. For Jean, it had been a requirement, a routine she followed because she was told to. But after Relkan, something changed. When she closed her eyes, the world didn't fade the way it should. It sharpened. Every sound in the temple seemed louder. Every breath, every heartbeat, every whisper behind the walls felt painfully real. The clarity she once had became something else. Weight, not on her body, on her mind. The instructors noticed it first during evening practice. The younglings settled into lotus position, palms open, eyes soft. Jean sat among them, as she always did, calm, straight-backed, still. But when the room fell silent, she didn't breathe. Not at first. She listened. The force moved gently at the edges of her awareness, but something deeper was beneath it, like a current underwater. A rhythm, a pulse, a presence that wasn't hers but flowed through her with perfect ease. And when she reached toward the force, it didn't respond. It stepped aside, like it was making room for something else. Her fingers twitched, her heartbeat slowed, her thoughts began to echo not as thoughts, but as mirrored impressions, repeating back to her in a voice she knew but didn't remember speaking with. The instructor called her name, Jean. She didn't open her eyes. Instead, she heard her own voice whisper back inside her mind. Not now. The instructor shivered and didn't know why. The other Padawans felt it too, a faint pressure. Like the room had grown smaller. Like someone was standing behind them even though they were alone. The youngest began to fidget. Another opened her eyes, suddenly uneasy. And Jean exhaled. The lights flickered. A ripple moved through the force, so small and so quiet that no one recognized it for what it was, a boundary shifting. A threshold crossed. The kind that cannot be undone once stepped through. Her eyes opened. And the instructor saw it, not darkness, not corruption, but something more unsettling. Recognition. As if Jean had found something in the silence she had been waiting for her whole life. The session ended early. The Padawans left quietly. But Jean remained seated in the empty room, her hands resting on her knees. She wasn't meditating. She was listening. The presence inside her thoughts, the one awakened in the vault, was clearer now. Not overpowering. Not demanding. Simply there. Its voice matched hers perfectly, tone for tone. But it carried weight that hers didn't. The weight of knowing. Of remembering. Why do you fight it? The voice breathed inside her mind. She didn't answer. Why do you pretend they can teach you what you already are? She stood without meaning to. Her breath felt unfamiliar, like she was borrowing it. The walls of the meditation chamber seemed thinner, the air sharper. Outside the room, two knights stood watch. They whispered to each other low, unaware she could hear every word. She's struggling, or awakening. Should we tell the council? No, not yet. Their voices trembled, not because of what they said, but because of what they sensed but couldn't explain. Jean walked past them, silently. Neither knight spoke to her. Neither dared. It wasn't fear of the girl they saw. It was fear of the quiet following her. Because somewhere in that quiet, something was alive. And it was beginning to remember her name. The Jedi taught that feeling was not the enemy, but it was dangerous. Emotions, they said, were to be observed, not followed, not embraced. The Force was a current, not a possession. Let go of fear, let go of anger, let go of everything. But Jean wasn't afraid of feeling. She just didn't know what it was. Not truly. Until now. It began with stillness, not the kind the temple taught, but something deeper. A stillness that didn't lead to clarity, but to memory. And in that memory, the voice began to shape itself. Not with words, with presence. It didn't call itself Sith. It didn't offer secrets. It didn't tempt. It understood. Understood her questions before she could ask them. Understood the hollowness that had followed her from the outer rim, through the gates of the temple, through every silent trial and quiet whisper. She had never been angry. She had never been curious. She had simply been waiting. And now, she wasn't alone in that wait. One night, after curfew, she stood in the training hall. Alone. No lightsaber. No instructor. Just empty space and quiet breath. She closed her eyes, and the presence moved with her. Not controlling, not guiding, mirroring. She stepped forward. Her foot landed without thought. Her hand rose in an arc not taught in temple forms. Her body moved the way water flows, not practiced, not trained, but returned. Returned to something that had never left. And with every motion, she began to feel something she didn't have words for. Not power, not purpose. Herself. Not the version shaped by instruction or structure. The self beneath the silence. The self that hadn't cried at birth. The self that had spoken to wind and memory long before the Jedi came. For the first time, she didn't feel cold inside her own mind. She felt heard, and with that came something new, something the Jedi had never given her. Warmth, not kindness, not comfort, recognition. The Force wrapped around her, not like a teacher, but like a mirror, and in that reflection, she saw what they had tried to avoid. Not darkness, depth. It wasn't hate, it wasn't love. It was weight, the kind of emotional gravity that no Jedi had taught her how to carry. Because they feared it. Because they had forgotten how heavy it could be. Gean didn't fear it. She stepped into it, and it welcomed her. Not with commands, with presence. The next morning, she returned to the gardens. The youngest students were playing in the distance. A few turned to wave. She nodded softly, but said nothing. She sat beneath the same tree she had sat under many times before. But now, the stillness felt different. Not empty, balanced, and somewhere in the heart of the temple, a senior master paused in his meditation. He had felt something, not dark, but undeniable. The same way one feels when thunder moves under the ground, not yet above the sky, not yet heard, but rising. Later that evening, when asked if she had meditated that day, Gean simply nodded. No one asked what she felt. But if they had, she would have answered truthfully. She felt sadness. She felt peace. She felt herself. And somewhere beneath that, the voice remained. Still, quiet, not as a guide, as a part of her, waiting for the moment when she would speak first, and when that day came, it would listen. Most initiates wait years for a master. Some are never chosen. Even those with talent are told to be patient, that readiness is measured not by skill, but by time, humility, and service. But time meant nothing to Gean. And humility was never something she had to learn. It was simply the shape of her silence. When she was 16, the council convened in private. They didn't vote. They observed. They replayed holo recordings, not of her saber technique, which was precise, fluid, impossible to categorize, but of her presence. Of the way Padawans followed her without instruction. Of how rooms quieted when she entered, even before anyone noticed her. They reviewed mission logs from her training assignments. No failures, no conflicts. And in more than one case, diplomatic tensions ended before negotiations even began, as if her presence alone disrupted fear. She was not praised. She was passed forward. There was no ceremony, only a quiet announcement. She was to be granted the rank of Jedi Knight. One master objected. She has not been tested. Not truly. But the room said nothing in return, because they knew what he meant. She had been tested by things they could not see, by something none of them had dared name. She was knighted alone, in a narrow chamber on the upper floors of the temple. The saber that touched her shoulder belonged to no one she had trained under. There was no speech, no smile, only a question. Do you accept this responsibility? She said, yes, but something behind her eyes was already somewhere else. Afterward, she returned to her quarters. She folded her new robes carefully. She stared at the insignia they gave her and placed it inside a drawer she never opened again. Within weeks, she was taking assignments. Low-level, non-violent, escort missions, settlements in distress, trade routes affected by local disputes. Nothing that required combat, nothing that drew the eye of the Senate. But something in her demeanor had shifted again. She stopped sitting with other knights in the halls. She stopped appearing in temple records between missions. And when she walked through the central corridors, she was always alone. Not avoided, not feared, just unaccompanied. As if no one could find the right words to stand beside her anymore. Some thought it was arrogance. Others thought it was grief. But Gean felt neither. She felt distance, not from them, from what they served. The Jedi taught obedience, surrender. They bowed to the Force and called that balance. But Gean had felt something else. Something older than balance, something patient. And it wasn't asking to be served. It was asking to be remembered. She wasn't turning away from the Order. She was drifting beneath it. Like a shadow passing beneath still water, unseen by those watching the surface. One day, a young knight approached her after training. He asked if she would take on a Padawan. She looked at him for a long time, then answered, I already have. But there was no student beside her. He never asked again, because in her voice there was no uncertainty, only truth. And somewhere far from the temple, across systems not tracked by Coruscant's archives, her footsteps had already begun to carve out something new, a place where she would no longer wait for approval, a place where her silence would no longer be tested, only followed. She never asked to teach, but they came to her anyway, Padawans, not assigned, not ordered, just drawn. The youngest sat near her during meal times. The older ones lingered at the end of sparring drills, pretending not to watch how she moved. They never asked for instruction. They asked for presence, and Gean gave it. She never lectured, never quoted the code. But when she spoke, she used words that felt older than the temple, softer, slower, the kind of words that stayed in the mind for days. You're not here to control the Force, she once told a Padawan struggling with balance. You're here to remember what it already knows. The boy nodded like he understood. He didn't, but he stopped falling during training. The instructors noticed it too. Students who spent time near her performed differently, not faster, not stronger, just deeper. Their questions grew more quiet, their movements more aware, like they were listening for something beyond the drills, and sometimes they heard it. Some called it focus, others called it calm, but the masters knew it was something else. Influence. Subtle, unspoken, unmeasured, but real. One senior knight, Master Ryalis, pulled her aside. He asked if she was offering unsanctioned lessons. She said no. He asked again, more directly. She looked at him without blinking. "They're learning on their own," she said. "I'm only reminding them what they've forgotten." Rielis filed a report. But no action was taken. Because no rule had been broken. Not yet. Gean began spending more time off-world, not to avoid the temple, but because it had stopped being the only place where Jedi learned. She traveled to minor systems, uncharted outposts, satellite academies where young Force sensitives were trained by local watchmen. In those quiet places, she became something more than a visitor. She became legend. They called her the Knight Who Listens, the Silent Master, the voice without command. And wherever she walked, students found a new way to hear the Force, not as an order to be obeyed, but as a rhythm to be joined. She never told them to question the council. She never criticized the code. But those who listened to her left changed. Not rebellious, just aware. The kind of awareness the Order feared most. Because it didn't lead to anger. It led to clarity. And clarity could not be taught. It had to be remembered. One young Twi'lek student, no older than 10, followed her between lessons. When Gean finally turned to ask why, the girl said, "When I'm around you, the Force doesn't feel like a test." Gean didn't answer. But she didn't tell her to stop following either. The council reviewed her movements quietly. They didn't question her success. They questioned her effect, because those who spent time near Gean stopped asking the usual questions. They stopped waiting for approval. They stopped trying to prove themselves. And they began moving differently. With purpose. With solitude. With silence. Just like her. Not out of loyalty. But out of recognition. And in time, the council stopped assigning students to missions with her. They said it was to maintain structure. But it wasn't structure they were preserving. It was distance. Because the one thing they couldn't teach was now being learned in her presence. And they couldn't define it. Because they had no name for a lesson the Jedi never gave. She stopped requesting missions. They were offered to her before she could ask. Not the high-profile negotiations. Not the council-led interventions. These were quieter assignments dispatched through back channels. Through watchmen who trusted silence over doctrine. Isolated border conflicts. Civil disputes with no witnesses. Systems barely on record. She never asked why they sent her. And they never asked what she found. She traveled alone. No Padawan. No escort. Sometimes, she didn't even take a temple vessel. She would arrive in freighters, blend in with relief teams, wear civilian robes. And when she stepped into a broken city or a fractured government, things changed quickly. Not because she imposed will, but because something lifted. One governor in the Virelia sector later described her presence this way. "It was like my fear had been named, not taken away, just seen. And once it had been seen, it couldn't control me anymore." Gean said almost nothing during that meeting. And yet, the conflict ended within a day. There were no recordings. No reports. Just outcomes. Other missions went deeper. Tribal wars on unregistered moons. Force cults surfacing in ancient ruins. Smugglers claiming to channel dark energy through stolen artifacts. She investigated them all. Alone. Efficient. Unflinching. One such assignment led her to a mining station carved into a dead asteroid near the edge of wild space. The miners had uncovered something old, a shrine of black stone embedded deep in the rock. Soon after, workers began disappearing. Dreams turned violent, machinery failed. She entered the lowest chamber, stayed inside for 3 hours. When she emerged, she asked for no payment. No transport. She left without a word. The shrine collapsed 2 days later during a controlled detonation. But the engineers who triggered the charges said one thing felt strange. They never set the timers. The countdown had already begun. When they asked who authorized the sequence, no one could answer. When they checked the logs, the control codes had been entered by a clearance that didn't exist. By the time the Jedi sent someone to verify, Gean had already left the system. She never filed her report. And no one followed up, because over time, her mission stopped being tracked altogether. Not officially, just quietly. She was listed as active, deep rotation. No supervisor, no oversight, no questions, and the Order allowed it. Because her results were undeniable. But so was the fear. Not of what she did, of what she didn't say. She no longer asked for approval. She no longer confirmed assignments. She simply moved. From one shadowed corner of the galaxy to the next, always arriving before records could be updated. Always leaving before anyone knew she was gone. In her absence, rumors filled the gaps. They said she walked through war zones and ended them without a weapon. That she spoke to dying planets and heard answers in the wind. That she was not a knight anymore, not truly but something else. A watcher, a remnant, a lesson left unfinished by the Force itself. And while the Council debated how to define her role, she was already preparing for her next mission. One that would not be requested, one that would not be filed. Because the next step in her path wasn't for the Jedi, it was for her. She never left the Jedi Order. Not officially. There was no exile, no confrontation, no declaration in front of the Council. Her lightsaber was never taken from her. Her robes were never folded in protest. She remained in good standing by title, if not by presence. But the temple no longer expected her to return, and she no longer felt drawn to its halls. Not out of anger, not rebellion, out of clarity. There were places she began to revisit, not listed in her assignments, not tied to diplomacy. Old sites, echoes of lost teachings, caves where the Force pooled like water. Ruins where ancient names had been scratched away by time. She didn't seek power. She sought memory, not her own. The galaxies. She sat where Sith Lords had once whispered their vows, where Jedi had once questioned their path. She didn't judge them. She listened, and in that listening, she began to feel something she had never found in the temple. Not belonging, balance. The Force was not order. It was not chaos. It was continuity. And she was a thread in it, not a chosen one, not a guardian, not a weapon. Just present, fully, unshaped by titles, unmoved by legacy, free. The Jedi called such thinking dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it could not be taught in steps. Because it could not be measured. One day, on a moon near the edge of the expansion region, she found a place without history, no name, no marker, just stone and wind. She built nothing. She planted no flags, but she returned there often. Sometimes for weeks, sometimes for minutes. No comm signal, no locator beacon, just silence. And yet, when she sat beneath the sky, the Force hummed around her, not loud, not bright, but aware. Like it recognized her not as a user, but as a listener. She was still contacted occasionally. Requests from watchmen who remembered her. Messages from former students who didn't know where else to turn. She answered rarely, but when she did, she arrived without warning. And always left before they could thank her. Back on Coruscant, her name was mentioned less and less. When it was, it came with questions. Is she still one of us? Was she ever? But no accusations ever followed, because no rule had been broken, and those who tried to summon her back found they couldn't. Not because she refused, but because she was already beyond reach, walking a path that no one else could see. Even those who once feared her began to understand. She hadn't turned against the Jedi. She had simply walked past them. Not above, not below, just beyond. She had no followers, no school, no doctrine, but her silence spread like light behind a storm. Quiet, patient, present, and in time, those who sought her stopped asking where she had gone, because the ones who truly listened felt that she had never left. There was no warning, no tension in the air, no whisper of conflict, no tremor in the Force, just an ordinary dawn on Coruscant, filtered through the high windows of the Jedi Temple. The halls were quiet, the fountains steady, the younglings preparing for morning drills, and somewhere on the fourth residence level, a door slid open to reveal an empty room. Jean's room. Her bed was made exactly as she'd left it the night before. Her robe was folded neatly on the chair. Her datapad rested on the desk, its screen dark. Nothing was out of place. Except for one thing. Her lightsaber lay at the center of the floor, not dropped, placed, perfectly parallel to the room's axis, perfectly still, as if the room itself had positioned it that way. A symbol the Order had used for thousands of years, one that said, without a word, "I am finished here." It wasn't anger. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a conclusion. The first knight to discover the room froze at the threshold. He called for the council. But even before they arrived, they understood. Her presence, faint, calm, always listening, was gone. Not faded, gone. As if she had simply stepped into another life between breaths. Masters filtered into the room in pairs, speaking quietly. Some tried to sense her through the Force. They felt nothing. Not because she was hiding, but because she wasn't reaching back. Others examined her belongings, looking for a clue, a note, a trace of conflict. There was none. The council gathered around the lightsaber. They stood in a circle, but no one touched it. No one dared, because they knew what it meant. Knights leave their sabers only twice in life, when they die, or when they choose a path the Order cannot follow. And Jean was very much alive. She had walked out the front gates, past the training grounds, past the temple steps, past the city, the Senate, the sky, without permission, without farewell, without fear. Some believed she would return by nightfall. Others believed something inside her had shifted long ago, long before the missions without witnesses, long before the Padawans who mirrored her silence, long before the council began whispering in corridors. A few masters suspected the truth. She had not left suddenly. She had been leaving for years. Quietly, softly, one belief at a time. The council met in emergency session. They spoke of duty, of retrieval, of the dangers of inaction. But none of them volunteered to go after her, because each of them felt the same hollow certainty. If Gean wished to be found, she would be standing in front of them. If she did not, they would never reach her. Outside the chamber, students whispered. Rumors spread through the halls. Some said she had been taken by Sith remnants. Others said she had turned to darkness quietly. But those closest to her knew better. She did not hate the Jedi. She did not defy them. She simply stepped out of their shadow. There was no betrayal, only departure. The temple archived her file that afternoon. Status: missing. presumed defected. But the archivist hesitated before sealing it, sensing a contradiction in every word. Defection required rejection. Rebellion required conflict. But Gean had left like a quiet breath at sunrise, an ending without struggle, a beginning without ceremony. She carried no weapon. She followed no master. She obeyed no doctrine. And somewhere far beyond the city world, beyond the hyperlanes and charts, she walked alone, not toward darkness, not toward light, toward something only she could hear. She didn't vanish. She moved. Away from Coruscant's orbit, past the lanes guarded by traffic control, beyond the thin boundary where beacons faded and the stars stopped blinking. Her ship left no trail. It wasn't stealth, it was choice. Quiet choices. Always quiet. She didn't go into hiding. She went into silence. There were no maps for where she was going. No destination entered in the navicomputer. Just a direction. A pull. Something the Jedi never taught her how to follow, not with star charts or hyperspace vectors, but with instinct. She flew for days without speaking. Only the hum of the engines beneath her. Only the soft rhythm of her own breath. And beneath even that, the voice, still hers, still waiting, still listening. She passed old space stations abandoned since the hyperspace wars, drifted near ringed moons where forgotten ships circled in rust. Once, she landed on a planet whose name no longer existed. There were no life forms, no structures, just wind. But the force was there. She felt it in the stone, in the soil, in the quiet between gusts. It didn't call her. It recognized her. And she stayed. She didn't meditate. She didn't build. She walked. Hours through dead forests, miles through craters formed by wars the Jedi no longer studied. And each step felt less like travel and more like memory. One evening, she stood before a jagged cliff and watched the storm roll in. The wind tore at her robes. The rain soaked through her clothes, and, for a moment, she felt something she had never felt in the temple. Freedom. Not freedom from rules. Freedom from the need to name what she was feeling. She sat in the storm, closed her eyes, and listened again. But this time, the voice didn't echo. It aligned. Not over her. With her. It wasn't a separate presence anymore. It was familiar, intimate, still silent, but not empty. It was her own will, sharpened by every lesson the Jedi had failed to teach and every one she had uncovered in the quiet. She spoke aloud for the first time in days. Not to the Force, not to the voice, to herself. And what she said was simple. I know what I'm not. The galaxy wouldn't hear those words. No council member would witness her revelation. No archive would record it. But something in the air shifted, as if the storm had paused, just long enough to acknowledge her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. But the stillness inside her no longer needed permission to grow. It had crossed the threshold. And in doing so, so had she. Back in the temple, knights were taught to resist attachment, to let go, to release identity into the river of the Force. But Gean hadn't let go. She had held on. To what made her different. To what made her quiet. To what made her feel. And now, the path ahead was no longer shadowed. It wasn't lit either. It was open. And in that openness, she walked forward. Not fast. Not slow. Not toward destiny. But toward memory. Because she wasn't searching for something. She was returning to it. The temple didn't close its doors. It didn't strengthen its borders. It didn't increase surveillance. There were no orders to track her. No search parties launched into deep space. Instead, the halls returned to routine. at least on the surface. Because beneath that rhythm, the silence left behind was heavier than her presence had ever been. For weeks, the council waited. No transmission, no request, no sighting. One master suggested issuing a quiet recall. Another advised caution. She hasn't harmed anyone, they reminded. She left the saber, another whispered. And then the question came, unspoken but present in every chamber. What if she isn't lost? Not corrupted, not confused, just gone. Not away from them, beyond them. Padawans noticed first. Her absence was not like a missing teacher, it was like a missing language. Those who had once trained under her grew distant, more introspective, more withdrawn. They still followed the code, still passed their trials, but something was missing. Not discipline, not loyalty, alignment, and the council began to worry about echoes. Not rebellion, not defiance, echoes of her tone, of her pace, of her questions, the ones she never asked aloud, but left behind in the way she listened. One student withdrew from training entirely, requesting solitude on a distant moon. Another left the order to serve as a medic in ungoverned sectors. Neither spoke of Gean, but both had trained with her, and the order began to feel what they had feared from the beginning. She had not left alone, not physically, but in spirit. She had become an absence that others began to follow, and that kind of absence was dangerous. A few younger knights suggested a formal inquiry. One even recommended sending agents into the Outer Rim to trace her. The council did not approve it. Not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't. Because if they did, they might have to name what she had become. And they couldn't. There was no word in their doctrine for it. Not traitor, not exile, not shadow, only silence. And silence, they had learned, couldn't be recalled, only remembered. So they moved on. They reassigned her missions, scrubbed her records from the public training archives, filed her file under wire status unknown. And yet, in the Hall of Mirrors, where masters sometimes wandered alone to reflect, her presence still lingered, faint, like a shadow cast from a star too distant to see. Master Oren Davi, one of the first to recognize her difference, was once asked what he would do if she returned. He said only this: "I wouldn't ask where she's been. I would ask if we ever truly met her at all." The Order teaches that no one is above the Force, that the light will always guide those who serve it. But what happens when the light becomes the wrong language? When the guidance feels like a circle with no end? They called her gifted, they called her quiet, but they never called her free, until she left. And in leaving, she became something they didn't understand. Not an enemy, not a lesson, a mirror. And mirrors in the Jedi Temple are rarely welcome, because they show not what is missing, but what has always been there. There was no ceremony, no dark coronation, no rite beneath a crimson sky, no whispers from ancient spirits. She didn't kneel, she didn't swear, she didn't change her name. Ascension, for her, came without a sound. It happened the way snow settles on stone, slowly, without announcement, until one day, the shape beneath is different, not gone, not broken, but hidden, rewritten. She found a world that had no name, not on maps, not in memory. It was buried between star lanes, wrapped in gravity wells and ion storms, the kind of place that should have been forgotten. But she found it anyway. The land was cold, covered in mountain ranges twisted by tectonic violence. The sky hung low. The nights lasted longer than they should have. She didn't come for shelter. She came because the Force pulled there. Not like a beacon, like a wound. Something had happened there, long before the Republic, long before the Jedi. And the land still remembered. She didn't search for ruins, she didn't open doors. She simply walked until the ground stopped echoing. And then she listened. There was no dark side here. Only depth. She sat beside a frozen lake and closed her eyes. The voice was already there, not speaking, not guiding. It no longer existed outside of her. It had become part of her thoughts. Not an influence, a shape, and that shape began to spread. It didn't promise power. It didn't promise truth. It offered nothing. And in that nothing, she breathed. The Jedi believed ascension came through detachment, through letting go, through surrender. But Gean hadn't surrendered anything. She had reclaimed it. The pain, the silence, the self. She had not rejected the order. She had simply stepped out of it, like a hand slipping out of a too tight glove. What remained was not rebellion. It was recognition. She wasn't Jedi. She wasn't Sith. She was still, fully, entirely, and that stillness reached outward. The animals near her stopped fleeing. The cold began to feel like home. Her body slowed, but her awareness widened, as if the planet had opened its own breath to join hers. As if the Force, unshaped by light or dark, had accepted her presence not as a servant, but as an equal. She spoke only once, not aloud. Inside, "I'm here." There was no answer. But something shifted, not in the air, in the pattern. It was no longer the Force flowing through her. It was her will flowing back into the Force. Balanced, unbound. When she opened her eyes, the stars above the lake looked different. She was not more powerful. She was not more dangerous. But she was more. A shape the Jedi could not describe. A presence the Sith could not recruit. A path that required no followers, no armies, no temple. She left that world as quietly as she had arrived. No trace, no echo. But something in the Force remembered her. A weight, a mark. Like a hand pressed into still water, long after the hand has gone. In time, people would speak of her again. Some would say she had fallen, others that she had vanished. But both would be wrong, because she had risen. Not above them, but beyond them, and she didn't need anyone to witness it. Because the Force had seen her, and in doing so, it had changed. The galaxy never felt the moment it started. Not the Jedi, not the Sith, not the Republic senators drowning in politics, or the smugglers running shadow routes at the edge of wild space. No alarms were raised, no holonet broadcasts marked the shift. No prophet saw a vision. But somewhere between the fall of one war and the rise of the next, a quiet fracture appeared. And its center was her. Darth Gean, though she had never taken that name aloud, moved like a whisper between stars. Not as a conqueror, not as a fugitive, as something far simpler, a listener. She traveled without pattern, without base, without allies. Some worlds she visited only once. Others she returned to, not because they needed her, but because something in the Force tugged her back like unfinished sentences waiting to be spoken. And each place she stepped into changed. Not visibly, not immediately, but unmistakably. A border skirmish in the Cathari sector ended overnight. Two warlords who had exchanged fire for months suddenly refused to pick up their weapons. When questioned, both gave the same answer, though neither understood why. "We were done." A mercenary group that had terrorized the outer trade lanes vanished mid-jump. Their last transmission described calm, total calm before the signal cut. On a moon near the Hydian Way, a cult worshipping an ancient terror sealed their own vault, destroyed their relics, and surrendered to Republic forces without resistance. The leader simply said, "She stood in the doorway, we could not continue." But no one saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. No one ever saw her draw a weapon. This was not war by strategy. This was war by presence, by silence. The Jedi began to sense disturbances, the kind that didn't match Sith techniques or dark rituals. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, a stillness so deep it smothered the Force itself, leaving only a faint impression like fingerprints on air. Tracing it led nowhere. Every path dissolved into quiet. Jedi teams sent to investigate never encountered battlefields. They found rooms with chairs still warm, fires still burning, meals half-eaten. Places abandoned not in panic, but in finality. As if the people living there had simply stopped needing to exist. The Order struggled to categorize it. They called it mysterious. They called it strategic. But those were words for things they understood. This was not one of them. And while they searched for patterns, Jane walked deeper into the unknown, into fragmented sectors untouched since the Mandalorian Crusades, into asteroid fields carved by extinct hyperlanes, into ruins older than both Jedi and Sith. She didn't seek to rule. She didn't seek to punish. She sought threads. Threads of noise. Threads of violence. Threads of spiraling futures tied to fear, ego, hunger, ambition. Whenever she found one, she cut it. Not through death alone, through silence. And with each thread severed, the galaxy shifted in ways no council could predict. Wars that should have ignited burned out before the first spark. Leaders destined for tyranny retired unexpectedly. Pirate fleets dissolved across empty sectors. This was not peacekeeping. This was redirection. Invisible, precise, unrecorded. But every action left a subtle hollowness behind a quiet tension in the air, like a place holding its breath after a storm that never came. The Jedi later claimed these years were unusually calm. The Republic celebrated stability, but some in the Outer Rim whispered of a different truth. A lone figure, neither Jedi nor Sith, walking through shadows, leaving nothing behind but the feeling that something dangerous had just passed them by, and chosen not to stay. The war she waged did not begin with violence. It began with her absence, and the galaxy was too loud to realize that silence was the first strike. She never gave orders, never declared allegiance, never summoned followers or raised armies, and yet shadows moved where she walked, not in fear, not in worship, but in response, because something in her presence changed people, not their beliefs, their direction. Across the mid-rim, known assassins disappeared without a trace, not hunted, not killed, just gone. Whole syndicates emptied. Names erased from criminal networks, their accounts closed, their weapons dismantled. In some places, there were signs of conflict, broken doors, scorched halls, but no bodies. In others, nothing at all, only silence. In one case, a Mandalorian mercenary cell abandoned a long-standing contract overnight. When questioned, their commander simply said, "She looked at me, and I saw what I'd become." No further explanation was given. The Jedi would have called it coercion. The Sith would have called it weakness. But neither was true. Jean hadn't threatened them. She had revealed them. She stood in front of people who had shaped their entire lives around fear and violence, and simply offered them a mirror. Some shattered. Others turned away. but all of them changed course. Not because she demanded it, because they could no longer avoid it. On worlds plagued by quiet suffering cults, slavers, zealots, her influence moved like a tide. Temples emptied before she arrived. Leaders surrendered without being asked. There were no hollow recordings, no manifestos, only results. And after she left, something strange happened. Power did not return to the void. No one rushed to fill it. The silence stayed, as if the space she cleared had become untouchable, not sacred, but marked, like the ground had been rewritten. One warlord turned hermit later said, "She didn't destroy what I built. She reminded me I was never building anything at all." He died quietly 3 years later, alone, at peace. Even Force sensitives began to feel the shift. In deep meditation, isolated adepts and wayward learners reported strange impressions, not visions of fire, not dreams of war, but stillness, a presence, no name, no voice. Just a feeling that someone had stood beside them while they weren't looking, and had understood. The Jedi couldn't detect it. The Sith couldn't explain it. But those who lived in the quiet corners of the galaxy began to speak of her. A figure in plain robes, face half-shadowed. No blade, no warning, just the sense that everything about them, fear, anger, memory, had already been read before they opened their mouths. And in some cases, before they even arrived. Because not every change required her to be there. Some happened because of what she had left behind. An echo in the Force. Not dark, not light, something colder, calmer. The kind of energy that doesn't chase obedience, but creates alignment. One not bound by loyalty, only recognition. A few began to follow her path. Not openly, not together, just in small, uncoordinated steps. Pilots who chose different routes. Soldiers who left their battalions. Acolytes who stopped whispering chants they no longer believed in. None of them claimed to know her, but they changed because she had passed through their lives, and somehow they remembered who they were before they chose to forget. This was not a movement, not a revolution. It was something deeper. A shift without shape. A will without command. And though no one followed her by name, the shadows themselves began to turn in her direction. Because when silence has purpose, even those who live in noise begin to listen. They began as anomalies, unfinished reports. Dispatches from Jedi watchmen cut off mid-sentence. Republic transmissions flagged for review, marked by strange silences and static loops. Small things, unimportant at first, but they grew. A scout team went dark while patrolling the Morjai drift. No distress signal, no flight log. Their vessel was later found intact, floating in orbit around an unnamed world. Every system functional, every weapon untouched. The crew was gone. No damage, no trace, just absence. Elsewhere, Jedi archives began recording inconsistencies. Ancient temples believed inactive for centuries suddenly triggered proximity alerts. But when ships arrived to investigate, they found nothing but dust. Dust, and a faint impression in the Force as if someone had already come, already walked the paths, already chosen what to erase. In the Outer Rim, a remote monastery that once served as a sanctuary for rogue Force adepts sent a final message. She found us, and she did not forgive. That message was never authenticated. The Council classified it as myth, but more incidents followed. In the Hamas sector, a research outpost dedicated to studying dark side anomalies collapsed overnight. The survivors reported no attack, They claimed their lead researcher dismantled the entire program after spending 30 minutes alone in meditation. When asked why, he replied, "She let me see what I had become." He never touched the Force again. From system to system, the pattern grew clearer. But it wasn't conquest. It wasn't corruption. It was removal, not of people, of threads. Threads that tugged at deeper wounds in the galaxy nodes of ambition, fear, arrogance, hunger. These were the knots that kept war alive, even when treaties held, that twisted the Force, even when Jedi meditated. And Gean had begun cutting them. She didn't destroy fleets. She didn't burn temples. She simply found the tipping point and ended the story before it was written. A Sith cult preparing to awaken an ancient entity, gone before the ritual began. A corporate fleet bribing governors into civil war, disbanded by a single message sent from an untraceable origin. A Jedi Knight tempted by visions of absolute peace, returned to the temple, silent, and never spoke of what he saw. No witnesses, no explanations, no violence where none was needed. And yet, fear began to build anyway, not from destruction, but from disconnection. The Jedi began noticing memory gaps in the archives. Entire names removed from council records. Missions that no one remembered authorizing. One master tried to compile a timeline of Gean's last known movements. He stopped after 3 days. His final entry simply read, "The path folds behind her." Because it wasn't just people disappearing. It was momentum. Entire systems that had once been hotbeds of political intrigue, criminal syndicates, or Force cult activity began reporting peace. Not growth, not recovery, just quiet. As if history itself had stopped being written there. As if the future had been rerouted. The Republic assumed it was random. The Jedi called it balance. But in the forgotten places of the galaxy, a different truth was whispered. Someone had started cutting the strings that made the galaxy move. Not recklessly, not loudly, but with precision, with purpose. And every time a thread was severed, the Force grew quieter. Because her war wasn't against systems or orders. It was against noise. And in time, the galaxy began to feel it. Not in loss, but in stillness. She never wrote it down. There was no manifesto, no codex, no list of teachings etched into stone or recorded in a holocron. There were no students to carry it forward, no banner to bear. No temple to shelter its truth, but it existed, not as a belief system, as a rhythm, a direction that shaped her choices not with commands, but with clarity. It had no name, because naming it would have made it smaller than what it was. Jedi scholars who studied the aftermath of her actions tried to categorize it. Some called it moral disruption. Others labeled it Force dissonance. But none of their words felt right. They weren't describing a philosophy. They were describing a will, a pattern that unfolded slowly, without headlines or victories. One where power wasn't seized, it was uninvited. And conflict didn't end in peace. It ended in absence. Her steps didn't echo through history because she never needed history to validate them. She moved in places where history was erased, where broken ideologies clung to life by feeding on the forgotten. And she silenced them, not with judgment, not with destruction, with knowing. Her doctrine, if it could be called, that did not offer salvation. It did not promise hope. It did not divide the Force into light and dark, nor did it deny either. It moved beneath both. It asked no one to believe, only to remember. Remember what the Force felt like before it was divided, before it was claimed, before it was taught in pieces and sold as truth. And once someone remembered that, they no longer belonged to anyone. That was the threat. The Sith could not twist her. There was no fear in her to manipulate. The Jedi could not contain her. There was no doubt in her to guide. And the galaxy could not track her. There was no center from which she moved. Only a direction. Only intention. Only silence. In time, whispers of her name faded. Not because she was forgotten, but because no one could explain her without changing the story. To the Jedi, she was a wayward knight, a warning, perhaps. To the Sith, she was irrelevant, a lost mind without ambition. But to the Force, she was neither. She was the part of it that refuses to be interpreted. The part that slips through codes and temples. The part that doesn't speak, but remains. Some say she still walks the void between systems. Others believe she dissolved into the Force completely, not in death, but in presence. Not lost, just unseen. A memory that returns when the galaxy grows too loud. A shape that reforms when chaos forgets what silence sounds like. And though no one calls her master, and no one claims her lineage, the paths she walked have not closed, because her doctrine had no locks, no gates, no test to pass, only a choice. And once made, the choice could not be unmade. A few have tried to follow it, but most turned back, not because they weren't strong enough, but because they couldn't bear what it required. The willingness to become a shadow, without ever needing to be seen again. She never wanted a student. Not because she feared teaching, or power, or legacy, but because she knew the cost, not of failure, of proximity. To walk beside her meant silence deeper than any lesson. It meant knowing without being told. It meant becoming part of something that would never be named. But the boy came anyway. Not from the temple, not from a Sith academy. He wasn't sent. He wasn't chosen. He simply appeared one day, at the edge of a ruin she was preparing to leave behind. His ship was damaged. His robes were scavenged. He was young, but not unknowing. He had felt her long before he arrived. And when he saw her, standing alone in the clearing, surrounded by stone and silence, he said nothing, because he already understood. She would not ask why he had come, and she would not ask him to stay. For days, he followed her from a distance. He watched her walk through forgotten structures, brush her fingers against ancient walls, stand in silence while the wind changed direction. She never told him to leave, but she never acknowledged him either. Until the fourth night. He sat across the fire from her. She looked at him once, just once, and said, "If you stay, you listen." He nodded, but he didn't yet understand what listening meant. She didn't teach him lightsaber forms. She didn't explain Sith philosophy. She didn't tell stories of the Jedi or warn him of power. She only moved, and he watched. Sometimes, she would sit for hours without a word, and in that silence, he began to feel it, not boredom, not doubt, something sharper, pressure, the kind that stripped away pretense, the kind that forced reflection, not because of what she said, but because of what she saw. He spoke less. He walked closer, but he never stood beside her. Not truly. Because something in him still needed to be guided, still needed answers. And she offered none. He began to follow her into places he didn't recognize. Not just in the physical world, but in the Force. Places where echoes moved in patterns he couldn't understand. Where presence bent around her like a shadow avoiding the sun. She began to feel his frustration. He wanted instruction, structure, identity, and what she offered was the opposite. Stillness, One night, after returning from a ruin they had explored in silence, he finally spoke. "I want to know what you are." She looked up at the stars and said, "No." He thought it was rejection. It wasn't. It was warning, because knowing would mean becoming, and she already saw what he feared, that he wasn't ready to disappear. Not the way she had. Still, he remained. Weeks turned to months. He learned without knowing what he was learning. He moved with less sound, felt the force as tension, not flow. He began to hear things before they were spoken. And yet, the silence between them grew louder, because he was still waiting for permission, and she would never give it. Because if he needed it, he wasn't ready. But she didn't drive him away, because something in her knew what he didn't. He had already chosen this path, and one day, he would have to choose whether or not to remain on it. Not with his mind, with his will, because what she offered was not apprenticeship, it was reflection. And what he saw in her terrified him, not because she was powerful, but because she no longer needed to be understood. And the closer he drew, the more he feared what that would mean for him. He expected secrets. He expected revelation. He expected the kind of training whispered about in ruined temples, and forgotten Sith holocrons, words carved into stone, rituals spoken in dead languages, power earned through pain. But Gean gave him none of that. Her lessons were not spoken. They were endured. She taught him nothing directly. She corrected no stance. She offered no wisdom. She didn't mold him into something stronger. She simply allowed him to exist in her presence. And that was enough to begin breaking him. Because silence is not empty, it is a mirror. And every day he walked beside her, he saw himself more clearly than he wanted to. When he hesitated, she didn't reassure him. When he grew frustrated, she didn't calm him. When fear crept into his voice, she didn't soothe it. She only watched, not with judgment, not with pity, but with understanding so complete that it felt like she was seeing a version of him he had not yet become, or would never become. They traveled through ruined academies and dead worlds where the force felt thick and old. She walked without caution. He followed with caution over every step, expecting traps, illusions, teachings hidden behind pain. There were none, only stillness. Once, deep in a cavern carved by ancient hands, he asked, "Why don't you teach me?" She didn't look at him. "You learn." He clenched his fists. "But I don't know what I'm learning." That is the lesson. The words made him angry, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He wanted structure. She offered freedom. He wanted identity. She offered dissolution. He wanted a master. She offered reflection. And reflection was harder than any trial the Sith could have devised. He watched her meditate without closing her eyes. Watched her walk through storms without shivering. Watched her speak only when silence no longer needed to hold the weight. Her voice was calm, soft, but it carried something he couldn't define. Not authority, not power, memory, as if she was remembering the force instead of using it. And slowly, painfully, he began to imitate her. Not intentionally. It happened the way shadows mimic shapes. He spoke less. He listened more. He noticed things he had ignored before, the way the wind bent around old stone, the way the air changed when someone lied, the way the force didn't always push. Sometimes it waited. And she saw the change. Not with approval, not with pride, just recognition. But the more he became like her, the more he began to understand something he wished he hadn't. He could never reach her. Not truly. Because she was not walking the same path as him. She wasn't ahead of him. She was beyond him, and the more he tried to close the distance, the more impossible it felt. Not because she blocked him, because she didn't need him, and he needed her. That imbalance became the center of every step they took. He admired her, feared her, wanted to understand her, hated that he couldn't. He once whispered, thinking she couldn't hear, "I don't know who I'm becoming." She answered without turning, "You're becoming honest." Silence followed, heavier than any blow. Because honesty, he realized, was the one thing he had been running from his entire life. And now it stood in front of him every waking moment. It wore her face. It moved with her steps. It breathed in her silence. And he didn't know if he could survive it. He didn't leave in the night. He waited until morning. She was seated beneath a weathered arch, watching the light shift through the broken stone, the same place she had meditated for 3 days without speaking, the same place where he once thought he could still reach her. He stepped into view, not quiet, not hidden, deliberate. She didn't look at him. "I'm going," he said. The wind didn't change. The light didn't flicker. She said nothing. "I don't belong here." Still, no response. It wasn't dismissal. It was permission. And that hurt more than anger would have. He wanted resistance, wanted her to stop him. Not to control him, but to prove he mattered. He stepped closer. "I gave you everything I had." She turned her head slightly. "No." The word cut deeper than any blade. "You gave me what you wanted to be seen." He clenched his jaw. The silence pressed in again, the kind that never asked for proof, never gave approval. And he broke. "I followed you," he said, "across war zones, dead temples, into places that tore my mind open. I stood in your shadow because I believed in you. But you never let me in." She stood, finally, and when she did, he took a step back. Not from her, from what was behind her. Because the force had shifted. He could feel it, not like a wave, not like heat, but like a presence behind a locked door, one she could open with a breath. He drew his saber. His voice shook. "You're not a teacher." She didn't move. "No. You're not a Sith. No. You're nothing." He wanted it to hurt. But she didn't react. Because she agreed. "I'm what's left when the need to be something is gone." He took another step. "I'm not afraid of you." But he was. Not because she would strike him down, but because she didn't need to. He charged. It wasn't a clean attack. It wasn't precise. It was desperate, the kind of strike meant to break silence, not bone. She didn't parry. She didn't lift a hand. The blade froze inches from her throat. His body locked. The force around him wasn't dense. It was still. So perfectly still that movement became impossible. Not because of power, because of choice. She looked him in the eyes and spoke. "You may go." He was shaking now. "I don't understand." "I know." Then, slowly, "But you still have a choice." He stared at her and saw it. The door he'd been afraid of since the beginning. Not a path to darkness. A path to truth. Hers or his. "If you leave," she said, "you must speak nothing of what you've seen. You must carry this silence, or let it consume you." He wanted to protest, to fight, but something in the way she looked at him, not as an enemy, not even as a failure, but as a question, took his voice. She lowered his saber by gently moving her eyes, not her hands, and in that moment he understood. She didn't win. She allowed him to remain, and he wasn't choosing between survival and death. He was choosing between noise and silence, and he wasn't ready to die. So he nodded. lowered his blade, and walked away. No words, no goodbye, just a single echo behind him as he crossed into a future shaped by silence. "You're still listening." He told no one what happened. Not the Sith who later found him. Not the acolytes who begged for stories. Not the shadows who watched him climb ranks with no scars, no rituals, no proof of loyalty. He let them believe he had survived something unspeakable. And in a way, he had. Because he didn't leave her. He carried her. Every word she never spoke. Every truth she never forced. Every silence she never explained. He didn't return to the Jedi. He couldn't. They would have called him lost. And he wasn't lost. He had been found by something they couldn't name. And it had shown him what power without shape truly was. He walked through Sith temples with perfect posture, never kneeling, never shouting. He killed when it was necessary, obeyed when it was useful. But inside, he was somewhere else. Still listening, still remembering. He never took the name she offered, because she never offered one. But in private, he whispered to himself the name the galaxy would never know her by. The one that meant nothing and everything. Gean. And though he built his reputation on fear, though others called him cruel, cunning, brilliant, there was always a boundary he would not cross. Not out of mercy, out of memory, because when he looked into the eyes of those who challenged him, he did not see weakness. He saw what she had seen in him. Someone still asking for permission. Someone not yet broken. Not yet willing. And so, he let some live. Not many. Only those who paused before their strike. Only those who still listened. He trained no apprentices. Not truly. He offered lessons, yes. Punishments, often. But never trust. Because he knew what it meant to stand too close to someone who did not need you. And he would not allow himself to become that reflection for someone else. He spoke her name only once. In a ruined archive room, long after the temple had collapsed. He stood alone in the dark and said, "She could have ended me." And then, softer, "But she didn't." Because she had never needed to. And the longer he lived, the more he understood. She had not spared him. She had changed him. Without touch, without violence, without promise. And he would never be free of that. Not because he was bound, but because he had chosen to survive it. And survival is its own kind of obedience. He rose within the ranks of Sith society. Some said he was destined for greatness. Others said he was hollow, a man without ambition, moving as if pulled by a force none of them could name. And they were right, because he had already touched something greater than legacy, something colder than power, something deeper than death. He never saw her again, but in every mirror, in every moment of stillness, in every decision that made him pause, she was there. Watching, not from above, not from beyond, from within. He did not fear her anymore, but he never stopped remembering her. And memory, when held in silence, becomes something permanent. He would outlive his enemies. He would rise and fall, as all Sith do. But one thing would remain unchanged. He would never speak of her, because she hadn't killed him. And yet, the man who left her presence never truly lived again. They began as fragments, a whisper during sleep, a moment of stillness in meditation that stretched too long, a face glimpsed behind the eyes, not in fear, not in light, but in something deeper. Not all Jedi spoke of it, but those who did described the same thing, a dream, not chaotic, not surreal, clear, always the same, a hall, long and empty, a woman seated at its center, hands folded, saying nothing, But the feeling was unmistakable. She was not waiting. She was remembering. And the Jedi were not invited. They were intruding. Some called it an echo. Others called it a resonance. The kind of sensation that comes not from thought, but from presence. A residue of something once living, still pulsing in the Force. The first to report it was Master Corlan Var, a temple overseer known for his rigid clarity. He spoke of the dream only once. "I was walking through the archives," he said. "But I wasn't walking. The shelves were taller than they should have been. Older. I felt watched, not by someone hiding, but by someone seated, without fear." He paused. She knew me. That dream never came again. But his meditations changed. His students noticed. He no longer gave lectures. He began assigning silence. He resigned from the council 2 months later. No explanation. No farewell. Just a single note. "There is a voice beneath the Force. We taught over it." More cases followed. Jedi across the mid-rim began reporting brief moments of dissociation. No loss of control. Just absence. A thought interrupted by stillness. A question answered by a feeling instead of a word. And always the same emotion afterward. Recognition. Some tried to trace it to identify whether it came from a specific nexus or anomaly. But there was no pattern. Because it wasn't a place. It was a presence. She had never returned. But something in the Force still carried her imprint, and it was speaking. Not loudly, not clearly, but intimately, like a memory that wasn't theirs. And those who felt it knew the same truth. It was her. Not alive in body, not lost in death, but moving beneath the surface. Some Jedi grew afraid, not because it was dark, but because it was other. Not balanced, not blinding, just aware. The dreams never gave instruction. They never promised knowledge. They only offered a seat, across from her. And those who dared to sit, woke with a feeling that had no name. Not peace, not sorrow, something quieter. Like a vow they hadn't spoken yet. The Jedi didn't ban discussion of these experiences, but they didn't encourage it either, because there was no doctrine that could hold them, and no discipline that could explain them. In time, the dreams spread, to watchmen, to healers, to archivists. Each described the same hall, the same posture, the same silence, and always the same eyes, not glowing, not commanding, just knowing. And every Jedi who had once heard of Gean even distantly, even long ago understood. She hadn't vanished. She had folded herself into something larger. And now, in the quiet places where the Force ran deepest, she was listening again. It started on Arcania. A holocron sealed for centuries opened by itself. Its gatekeeper flickered into view, then vanished. No damage, no malfunction, no tampering. When the archivists tried to access its memory again, there was nothing left. Only static, and in the static, one of them swore they heard a breath. Not a whisper, not speech, just breath. A week later, a similar report arrived from Ossus. A meditation chamber known for its deep resonance had gone cold. Knights reported unease during focus training. Not darkness, not disturbance. Something quieter. As if the Force had stepped aside and let something else pass through. At first, they assumed contamination, a fracture in the local nexus or residual energy from the Clone Wars. But no one had entered the room in months. Then came the silences, moments in which Jedi Masters lost thought during council debate. Pauses where time didn't stop, but meaning did. They would sit there, mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, not gone, just inward, as if listening to a voice not present in the room. And when they returned, none of them could recall what they had heard, only that it felt like a suggestion they had once believed themselves, but never spoken aloud. The term genic events began circulating among the archivists, unofficial, of course, but persistent, because the pattern was no longer coincidence. Wherever silence touched the Force, she was already there, not in presence, in resonance. Some younger Jedi began claiming her as a figure of meditation. They didn't worship her. They didn't fear her. They just listened. And in their silence, some claimed to feel clarity faster than traditional methods allowed. "Her presence lets me feel what the Force doesn't say," one Padawan wrote. He was transferred off-world the next day, not for punishment, for protection, because what disturbed the Council wasn't the influence. It was the absence of resistance. This wasn't dark side corruption. There were no visions of fire or conquest or death. There was no call to fall. Only stillness. A stillness that answered questions no Jedi had asked. And beneath that stillness, a truth even harder to name. The Force wasn't warning them. It was adapting. Some masters believed she had become a ghost, an echo too deep to erase. Others thought she was dead, but not gone like a stone cast into water, her mind still rippling through the current. But a few knew better, because they had once met her, not in dreams, not in visions, in life, and what they felt now wasn't memory. It was intent, not to control, not to teach, but to be heard, without sound, without rules, without offering herself as either enemy or ally. She moved between the walls, between thoughts, between the pillars of Jedi history, never trying to rewrite them, only watching to see which ones would fall on their own. And the Jedi, for all their clarity and order, had no answer for that, because she wasn't a threat they could face. She wasn't even a presence they could trace. She was proof that the Force had room for something they never prepared for. A silence with purpose, a silence that chose to remain. The first was born on Chandrila, a girl strong in the Force, healthy, but silent, not from illness, not from fear. She simply didn't cry, and when she opened her eyes, the attending Jedi healer felt something strange, not darkness, not resistance, just awareness, as if the child had already seen something. No scans revealed trauma. Her mind was whole. Her midichlorian levels were unusually high, but not unstable. Still, the silence remained. No wails, no fussing, no startled breath. She simply watched, quietly. The second came 3 weeks later on Corellia. A boy. Same signs, same stillness. He didn't make a sound for 2 days. And when he finally did, it wasn't a cry. It was a laugh. Soft, short, but wrong. Not in tone, in timing. It came while his mother wept beside his crib, like he was responding to her sadness, not with joy, but understanding. By the third report, the Council took notice. A pattern, all born within the same year, all Force-sensitive, all silent at birth. Jedi healers called them sky quiet, not as a diagnosis, as a placeholder. Because what they observed wasn't an illness. It was a calm, too deep for a newborn, as if they had arrived already listening. And the silence was not from delay. It was from choice. More were reported across the mid-rim, some from human colonies, Others from Mirialan, Twi'lek, even Zabrak lineages. The phenomenon was species agnostic, but not force agnostic. Only those strong in the current displayed the trait. And when Jedi visited them, some masters experienced something strange. The children would make eye contact, hold it, and the masters would forget what they had intended to say. Just for a moment, just long enough to realize they weren't in control of the room anymore. A few left, shaken. One, Master Elon Var, left the order. He never explained why. He simply handed over his saber and whispered, "They hear her." No one asked who, because deep down, they already knew. The Jedi had once tried to forget Gean, to redact her from records, to erase the trace of a knight who had never fallen, yet never returned. But you cannot erase silence. It becomes a rhythm, and rhythm finds new instruments. The sky-quiet children grew slowly. Some began speaking, but none loudly. And when tested with holocrons, many refused to interact, not out of ignorance, out of disinterest. They didn't seek teaching. They observed it, and in the temples where they walked, the force itself sometimes changed. Nothing visible, nothing dramatic, just a stillness in the air. Like memory had returned to a place it once knew. Some began saying the children were marked. Others believed they were empty. But the children didn't fight those words. They simply kept listening, as if awaiting a voice only they could hear. And when asked why they didn't speak sooner, a few of them answered the same way. There was already a voice. When asked whose voice, they said, "She doesn't have a name. Not anymore. Not to them. Because names are for those who need to be called." And she was already present, always listening, always watching, never claiming. And in their silence, they carried her forward, not as legacy, not as prophecy, but as proof that the Force remembers what the Jedi try to forget. There were many theories. Some said she had died in deep space, her body lost to the void, her spirit absorbed into the Force like any other fallen Jedi. Others believed she had become a wound like Malachor, like Nihilus, a scar that whispered through the currents of destiny. But those who had known her, those who had seen her in life, felt something different. She hadn't faded. She had lowered her voice. And the galaxy had mistaken that for absence. One night on Ossus, a senior archivist meditated alone. He had been studying anomalies among the sky-quiet children, but fatigue had worn him thin. His breath slowed, his thoughts dimmed. And then, he felt someone sit beside him. He opened his eyes. No one was there, but he wasn't alone. The air thickened, not with darkness, not with cold, with presence. The same presence once described in forbidden reports, in lost mission logs, in the trembling voices of knights who had glimpsed her before she walked away. He whispered her name, not loudly, barely a breath. "Gean?" Silence answered, but it wasn't empty. It was attentive. He asked the question no Jedi dared ask. "Are you gone?" And though no voice spoke, he understood the answer. "I was never here to leave." Across the galaxy, others felt it too. A knight meditating on Deveron sensed someone behind him, as if waiting to finish his thought. A healer on Alderaan heard a second heartbeat that wasn't her own during a Force diagnosis. A group of Padawans on Lothal stopped mid-exercise, each suddenly struck by the same unspoken emotion. Being observed, not judged, observed. And when they looked at each other, none knew why they'd stopped, but all felt the same presence fade at the same moment. The council refused to discuss it publicly. They feared panic, they feared rumors. But most of all, they feared acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would mean admitting something they couldn't accept. That she was still moving within the Force. Not as a ghost, not as a vision, as continuity. Like a piece of the current had learned her shape, and kept it. Some masters believed she had ascended, like ancient mystics who became one with the cosmic force. But ascension brings peace. And what they felt was not peace. It wasn't malice either. It was focus, a direction without sound, a presence without body, a will without ambition. A reminder that the Force is older than names, older than codes, older than the orders that try to divide it into light and dark. Gean had not joined the cosmic Force the way Jedi hoped to. She had sunk deeper into it, so deep that the line between her and the current blurred. And the Force, in turn, began to echo her. Her silence, her clarity, her refusal to be defined, her ability to see without asking, her way of changing a room simply by entering it without touching a single thought. The Jedi could not chase her. The Sith could not find her. No one could claim her, because she had become something no tradition had words for. A presence that exists only where silence survives. A memory that chooses to remember you. A watcher who watches without needing to be seen. And in the quiet places of the galaxy, where the Force moves slowest and thought feels heavy, some swear they can still feel her. Not haunting, not guiding, just there, exactly where she has always been. Inside the silence. Listening. They expected fire. The Senate, the Jedi, even the Sith. If Darth Gean had returned, they imagined it would come as war. A fleet, a dark ritual, something loud, something proud. But instead, planets began going quiet. Not all at once, not close together, but one by one. Quiet enough to be missed, quiet enough to be dismissed. Until it wasn't. The first was Belderon. A peaceful mid-rim colony, known for its shipyards. The entire southern hemisphere stopped transmitting. No distress call, no signs of battle. Republic scouts were dispatched. What they found made no sense. There was no destruction, no trace of attack, no bodies, no blood, just stillness. Doors were open, lights were still on. Meals sat uneaten on tables, transports hovered on standby, but no one moved. Over 400,000 people, gone. No evacuation, no signal, no sign of struggle. It was as if they had simply stopped being. The scouts tried to explain it: mass exodus, perhaps, a freak hyperspace malfunction, a plague, but there was no evidence. No footprints, no cargo missing, not even a broken window. Just silence. The Jedi sent a watchman. He didn't return. The Order sent 2 more. They returned, changed. Both refused to speak of what they'd seen. One left the Order entirely. The other fell into a deep meditative state and never emerged. The Senate demanded answers. They got none. And then it happened again. This time, on Kedar, a trading moon, a place of crime, corruption, and noise. All of it gone. When Republic forces landed, the buildings stood intact. Markets were still full, but not a single being remained. The air smelled clean, too clean, like nothing had breathed it in days. The pattern continued. In the outer rim, in neutral zones, in unaligned systems, always the same. No violence, no resistance, just removal. The Jedi began to worry, not because they feared an enemy but because they felt nothing at all. There was no ripple in the Force, no surge, no darkness, only absence. A void where the Force should have spoken, and didn't. Master Elia Vaughn, a respected seer, gave a rare public address. She said, "The Force is not turning away. It is watching, and it is waiting for us to understand what already arrived." But most didn't understand. They called it a phenomenon, a cosmic shift. The archives labeled it the Gean effect, not because anyone had seen her, not because they could trace her movements, but because the pattern matched her fingerprint. The quiet, the unclaimed, the unprovable, the absence that taught more than presence ever could. On Dantooine, a Force-sensitive child asked her master if the planets were sleeping. The master answered yes, and deep down he wished it were true. But Jedi don't lie to their students. So when she asked what they were sleeping from, he had no answer, because the truth was this: they were not asleep, they were gone, and whatever had taken them had not raised its hand, had not claimed responsibility, had not called itself Sith or Jedi or anything else. It had not arrived as an enemy. It had simply been there, and that was enough. The galaxy had always prepared for conquest, but it had never prepared for silence. And now, silence was spreading. Fear was not unfamiliar to the Sith. They were shaped by it, molded through it, taught to wield it until it bent into strength. Pain was a teacher. Terror was a tool. The weak trembled, the strong devoured. But when the first acolytes fled their own fortress on Zyast, their fear wasn't strength. It was instinct. It began with a single scream cut short, as if swallowed by the air itself. The guards rushed into the meditation hall. Nothing moved, nothing attacked. Torches flickered, then dimmed. The acolyte who survived whispered only 2 words. He watched. No shadow, no figure, just watching. Others felt it too, not a surge, not an approaching danger. A presence rising within them, like a second breath they didn't take. A gaze behind their thoughts, not pushing, not commanding, just present. A Sith Lord on Dromund Kaas collapsed mid-ritual. His apprentices tried to revive him, believing it was backlash from a failed invocation. But he wasn't hurt. He was shaking. He wasn't here, the Lord whispered. He was inside. Inside, not possessing, not controlling, just witnessing. And that was what broke them. The Sith feared power. They feared betrayal. They feared weakness. But they had no defense against being seen. Word spread through their hidden enclaves. Some dismissed it as myth. But when they tried to summon darkness, they felt something else ripple beneath it. Stillness, not light, not judgment. Stillness, as if something deeper had already measured their intentions and found them irrelevant. A Sith assassin on Korriban attempted to hunt the source. For 3 days he meditated in the tomb of an ancient lord, focusing his hatred into a blade meant to strike whatever presence lingered. When he emerged, he dropped the blade. "I cannot kill what does not resist," he said. Then he left the academy without taking supplies, transport, or weapons. He walked into the desert. He never returned. Sith archives tried to bury these accounts, not because they disproved doctrine, because they didn't. For the first time in centuries, acolytes refused to enter meditation chambers alone. Masters avoided prolonged solitude. Even the bravest chose to sleep in groups. Dark side rituals decayed. Their energies fizzled, their visions blurred. Whenever they reached for power, they felt it. A quiet refusal. Not a block, a boundary. The Force itself had changed. Not toward light, Not toward dark, toward her. On Moraband, one lord dared to speak her name aloud, a name he had only heard in rumor. In fear, in trembling breaths from those who'd left her path. Gean. The torches extinguished. The chamber grew cold. And every acolyte felt a chill ripple through the force, sharp enough to cut thought in half. Not as a warning, as recognition. They knew then what the Jedi had refused to accept. She wasn't hunting them. She didn't need to. They fled, not because she attacked, but because they sensed a presence that needed no violence, no ambition, no throne. A presence that looked straight through their rage and saw nothing worth shaping. For the Sith, that was the deepest fear of all. To face someone who didn't want their power. Someone who didn't need to defeat them, because she had already judged their path and found it too loud, too small, too temporary to matter. It began in the machines. Not weapons, not droids. Information systems. The quietest part of the galaxy. On Chandrila, an archivist opened a sector report only to find entire systems listed as blank. No population, no trade, no weather, just space. Yet she knew those systems were not blank. She had checked them the day before. When she reopened the file, it was gone. Corrupted, they said. An isolated glitch. But then the same thing happened on Brentala V, and again on Corellia, and again in the deep core places untouched by war, unaffected by instability. Entire star systems were vanishing from maps. But not from the stars. Ships still flew past them. Pilots still recognized their orbits. Yet official records had no trace. It was as if the galaxy had started forgetting itself. And forgetting why it forgot. Senators blamed slicers. Jedi blamed Sith. Sith blamed Jedi. But there was no breach, no manipulation, just absence. More dangerous than lies, more permanent than silence. The holonet collapsed in segments. Entire threads of historical record shredded without a trace of who removed them. Medical records, colonial registries, exploration logs, and still no one attacked. Because there was no attacker. The force was quiet, too quiet. On Anaxes, a military strategist cross-referenced command signals between fleets. His AI assistant failed to connect 4 confirmed locations. The result came back, coordinates not found. He manually entered them. Still nothing. Not even an error. Just emptiness. The next morning, he left his commission. He left no message. Only a name carved into his desk. Gean. It was then that the Jedi archives began cross-referencing missing files with old reports, incidents of anomalies tied to her early years. Rogue missions, conflicted council records, misaligned testimonies, and in the margin of every event, there had been silence, no official statement, no holocron transcript, no living record. Only witnesses who no longer trusted what they saw. Some whispered that she had become an echo in the Force. But this wasn't an echo. It was a filter. A choice in the current, removing details, altering conclusions, undoing memory. She wasn't erasing the past. She was replacing it with nothing. And the galaxy was accepting that. Because no one fought for what they didn't remember. No one mourned what they could no longer name. And still, she never appeared. Never gave a speech, never claimed a creed, never stood on a battlefield. She simply was a presence within absence, a consequence without a cause. She had learned what the Jedi never taught, what the Sith always feared. Control wasn't about fire. It was about focus. And focus doesn't always raise its voice. The Jedi tried to anchor what truth remained, but even they began forgetting. One by one, masters reported gaps in memory, not trauma, not loss. Just questions they couldn't remember asking. Thoughts they assumed someone else had spoken. The silence wasn't just outside. It was within. And the galaxy, vast as it was, had grown small in its thinking. Wounds once wide were now smooth. Ruins became landscapes. Graves became gardens. And without pain, there was no proof anything had ever been broken. That was her final lesson. Not destruction, not domination, but disconnection. From history, from opposition, from the need to be seen. Until the only voice that mattered was hers. And she never needed to speak it aloud. She had no banner, no doctrine, no citadel carved into obsidian or fleet of blood-soaked warships. Her name did not echo in Senate halls or rebel hideouts. She did not send emissaries. She did not occupy. She did not invade. But she moved things. Systems, minds, outcomes. Not by presence, by will. And in the end, the galaxy obeyed. It didn't understand why. It didn't see her coming. It simply followed. Because the force, that invisible breath flowing through all life, stopped resisting her. It aligned. She had no army because she didn't need one. Not anymore. Her influence didn't travel through orders or strategy. It wove through decisions not yet made. Through instincts commanders trusted without knowing why. Through last-minute course corrections that avoided disaster or steered straight into it. The Jedi had always believed the Force spoke, but Gean had learned how to listen first until the Force itself listened back. And once it did, it stopped whispering. It obeyed. On Malastare, peace talks collapsed after a negotiator forgot the name of the senator she had worked with for years. On Cato Moidia, trade guilds shifted policy after a new generation of leaders reported seeing her face in their dreams, not in nightmares. In silence. Always in silence. Even warlords who had never known her began acting like they did, correcting their path mid-sentence, hesitating before violence, pausing when no one else in the room did. They sensed something larger than them. And for the first time, they did not challenge it. Because it didn't challenge them. It erased the reason to resist. That was her greatest strength. Not fear, not fire, not chaos, clarity. A clarity so absolute, it crushed questions before they formed. The kind of clarity only found in stillness. In the deepest part of the Force, where no identity, no doctrine, no allegiance could survive. Where only truth remained. And her truth was simple. She was the outcome, not the actor, not the agent, the inevitable. Jedi, who tried to explain her, called it a shift in balance. Others called it corruption. But none of them could trace her steps. None could feel her presence. They could only feel what wasn't there anymore. Fear, doubt, noise. That's what frightened them most. The idea that she had not taken power. She had become it. Not by bending the galaxy to her will, but by becoming the path of least resistance, until every cause, every act, every consequence bent quietly in her direction. Not because she was louder, because she was quieter. And when the dust settled and the galaxy moved forward, her name was never spoken. Her form was never seen. But stars adjusted their burn. Winds altered their song. Children born in the years after blinked less often, smiled less freely, stared longer into corners of rooms where no one stood. And mothers said nothing, because the silence was peaceful. It was calm. It was full. And in that calm, she waited, not to be praised, not to be remembered, only to remain. The last Sith who never ruled, the last shadow that never struck, and the last voice the Force chose to follow. Not in battle, but in stillness. She was never seen again. No death, no battle, no final confrontation. One morning, her name vanished from the Jedi archives. Not deleted, erased. Entire entries collapsed inward, as if the Force itself rejected her memory. And those who tried to restore the files forgot what they were looking for. There was no trace, no tomb, no legacy, only a silence deeper than loss. Darth Gean had not died. She had stepped outside of record, outside of war, outside of the systems that needed her to be something they could understand. And the Force let her go. Some Jedi said it was a cleansing, that her absence proved the danger had passed, that whatever darkness she carried had dissolved into the current, never to return. But not all believed that. There were whispers, from knights who never left Coruscant again, from sentinels who meditated beside empty candles that never stayed lit, from younglings who didn't speak for days after reaching out through the Force and hearing nothing come back. Her name was not forbidden. It was unreachable. Even the Sith, fractured, scattered, clawing at power, did not claim her. She was not a rival. She was not a master. She was a shadow that moved alone and moved on. And because no one could own her story, they chose to deny it. Chronicles called her a myth. Holocrons referred to her in metaphor, the listener, the still one, the Force's drift. But no record called her Gean. No archive admitted what the galaxy once knew, that she had been real. The Jedi tried to bury it, quietly, without lies, only omission. They said some truths were too dangerous to preserve, that even the Council wasn't immune to fear. But they were wrong. It wasn't fear that silenced them. It was uncertainty. Because if she could vanish like that, no death, no defeat, what else could? What else already had? The Grand Archivist once wrote in a private entry, "There is a presence I cannot name. I feel it behind me, around me, between words. It is not light. It is not dark. It is only aware." He deleted the entry, but the feeling remained, and it wasn't just Jedi. Smugglers rerouted their paths around systems they couldn't name. Senators hesitated before passing bills that mentioned re-education, silence, surveillance. Pilots avoided certain hyperlanes without knowing why. And mothers in the Outer Rim told their children not to hum certain tones, because those tones echoed. In the corners of the ship, in the quiet of the night, in the places where memory used to live, because some memories were never meant to be held. Some names were never meant to be spoken, and some beings are not meant to be remembered the way others are. Darth Gean did not rise through the Sith. She did not fall from the Jedi. She departed, peacefully, unwitnessed, unopposed, and for all their vision, neither side saw her go. Because the Force didn't scream when she left. It exhaled, and in that breath, a wound opened. Not in history, but in truth. A tear between what the galaxy wanted to believe and what it could never explain. And so her name became what no name had ever become before. Not legend, not myth, but absence. The name the Force forgot. Meditation was supposed to bring peace, a return to calm, to balance, to the still center of the Force, where light and dark dissolve. But in the years after Gean disappeared, that center felt occupied. It didn't speak, it didn't threaten, it simply existed. And for Jedi who opened themselves fully, it was enough to make them close their minds again. They never described it as pain. It wasn't violent, wasn't chaotic. It didn't crush or wound. It only watched, like an awareness sitting just behind thought, waiting for something no one dared to name. Younglings would sometimes go quiet mid-lesson, their eyes unfocused, their breath held. And when their teachers called to them, they blinked, smiled, and said nothing had happened. But they remembered, not what they saw, only how it felt, as if something old and silent had just passed through them. Across systems, isolated from one another, Jedi began describing the same sensation. Not visions, not prophecy, just presence, a presence that brought no clarity, no message, only stillness. And the stillness lingered. Long after the meditations ended, long after the reports were filed, long after the conversations stopped, some Jedi left the Order, not in fear, in surrender, because the presence didn't ask them to resist. It asked them to listen, and once they did, they couldn't stop. The High Council debated calling it an echo, a residual psychic disturbance left behind by a powerful Force user. Something explainable, something safe. But the oldest members knew better. Because the presence didn't fade, it learned. Each time someone touched it even briefly, it changed. Adapted, not to hurt them, to understand them. That's what frightened the Council most. Not that Gean was still alive, but that she wasn't. And the presence that remained was no longer her. It was something she had become. Or worse, something she had revealed. Even Sith cults began to take notice. One sect on Droman Khas disbanded after its leader entered a week-long trance, emerged blind, and whispered just 3 words. "She is listening." He refused to speak again. Not out of madness, out of respect. He claimed there were no more teachings, only observation. Because what remained of Darth Gean didn't seek converts, didn't demand loyalty, didn't even claim existence. She simply waited. In the folds of the Force, where time forgets to flow. In the breath between thought and action. In the echo behind every unspoken question. And the more the galaxy ignored it, the more it grew, not louder, just closer. Until even those who didn't know her name began changing their speech patterns, taking longer pauses, trusting fewer instincts, choosing silence when words might have once sufficed. She wasn't haunting them. She was reminding them that the Force does not belong to light or dark. It belongs to awareness. And awareness doesn't die. It doesn't vanish. It simply remains, right where memory ends and fear begins. Shadows usually come from something. A tree, a building, a person who stands in the way of light. But some shadows are different. They do not come from an object. They are not cast. They are chosen. Darth Gean was one of them. She didn't inherit darkness. She didn't fall into it. She did not chase forbidden teachings, or swear loyalty to ancient spirits, or kneel before a master offering power in exchange for obedience. She walked toward stillness, and the stillness opened, not down into some abyss, but inward, into the part of the Force that the Jedi ignore, and the Sith try to control, and neither truly understands. The part that listens. Long before she vanished, before the archives erased her name, before the Council whispered about her in rooms locked from the inside, she had already stepped onto a path no order could follow, because neither order could claim it. It wasn't light. It wasn't dark. It was intention without identity, and that terrified both sides. The Sith called her a coward, a failure, a pretender. They said she lacked ambition. But ambition is loud. She was quiet. They said she lacked hunger. But hunger is restless. She was still. They said she lacked purpose. But purpose requires audience. She needed none. She wasn't a true Sith to them because she didn't want to be one. And she wasn't a fallen Jedi to the Order because she didn't fail. Failure requires expectation. She had none left for them. Her shadow was not cast by betrayal. It was shaped by understanding. She saw the Force not as a ladder to climb or a river to surrender to, but as a vast field of choices, each leading somewhere the Jedi feared and the Sith couldn't predict. And she walked straight through it, without hesitation, without justification, without looking back. The galaxy assumed a master had trained her. But the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. She had trained herself. Not through rituals, through silence, through listening so deeply that the Force began to respond. Not to her commands, but to her certainty. She didn't break the rules of the Jedi. She outgrew them. She didn't reject the path of the Sith. She passed through it. She didn't bend the Force to her will. She aligned her will to something older, something unshaped, unnamed. And in doing that, she became a shadow with no source, a presence with no beginning, a figure that did not exist in any doctrine because no doctrine had room for someone who needed none. Those who sensed her after she vanished realized the truth. She wasn't haunting the Force. She had become the part of it that is neither seen nor spoken, the part every being touches when they doubt themselves. When they pause before choosing, when they listen for an answer that isn't there. A shadow doesn't need followers. It only needs someone to stand near enough to feel it. And the galaxy had drawn very, very near. Because some shadows are not cast by light. They are cast by memory, by choice, by will. Gean's shadow chose itself. And once a shadow chooses itself, it never fades. There was no body, no funeral, no tomb, no relics passed down through acolytes claiming her name. The galaxy never buried Darth Gean, because it never admitted she existed. The Jedi struck her from their records. The Sith refused to mention her. And the Force itself, it seemed, responded in kind. Not with silence, with absence. The kind of absence that hums louder than presence ever could. On worlds she once walked, temples refused to open. Holocrons would flicker and go dark mid-activation. Sensitive children born during her era entered the world without crying. They didn't need to, because part of her was already there in their stillness. She wasn't worshipped. She wasn't studied. She was avoided, like a question with no safe answer, because she proved something no one wanted to believe. That the Force could be obeyed, without being followed. That the Force could be wielded, without identity. That the Force could be mastered, without ever raising a voice. And that mastery left no trace, only choices, scattered like whispers across centuries. In the doubts of Jedi Masters who hesitated for reasons they couldn't name. In the cold dreams of Sith Lords who feared no enemy, but woke sweating in silence. She didn't fight for power. She didn't build an empire. She didn't seek revenge. She listened, and when she understood, she let go. Of what? No one knows. Her name? Herself? Her voice? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. What remains is not a legacy. It is not a doctrine. It is not even a story. It is discomfort. The feeling that something is missing not because it was lost, but because it refused to be found. Across time, Force scholars would speak of the unseen doctrine, a presence with no teachings, A truth with no words. A shadow that did not spread but waited. The presence came and went, like wind in sealed chambers. It left no signature in the force, no trail, no darkness to trace. Because Gean was not the darkness. She was the choice to step into it, without fear, without hope, without needing to return, and that is why they call her the Sith who should not exist. Not because she broke the rules, but because she proved rules were never real to begin with. And if someone like her existed once, she could exist again, not as a villain, not as a savior, but as a silence so complete, the galaxy forgets how to speak. They say the Force remembers everything, but not her. She did not die. She did not ascend. She simply faded, slowly, quietly, completely, into the part of the Force that has no name, because it has no need for one.